us your name, please. What's your name?
Jim Sadler, James R. Sadler.
Okay. And
That's two D's, Saddler.
Okay. What year were you born?
March 23rd, 1934,
Okay.
Portsmouth, Ohio.
Okay. And are you're from Portsmouth? And
Oh, yes.
you grew up. You were telling me you grew up.
Well,
on...
before the 1937 flood, we lived on Gage Street, just west of Maybrick Road. Sometime during the 1937 flood, we departed Gage Street in a rowboat and ended up at 17th and Maybrick Road. And my father and mother, I was probably 3 years old, 4 years old, whatever, walked on up to 2444 Maybrick Road, and that's where they remained to their passing. I lived there until I went in the Navy.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I see you've got something over there. I think that's related to
it's
the
a metal plaque that there's several. I think there is one posted in the post office, and there's several of these that are on buildings throughout Portsmouth, Ohio, and it's just a brass plaque that indicates the high water level during the 1937 flood. On January 27th, 1937, the water level was 74.23 feet in Portsmouth. So this came from an old building down on Market Street that was totally involved in a fire, and it collapsed, and this was laying there, and so I grabbed it and took it back to the fire department with me. And the problem with buildings on Market Street then and now, when one got on fire, generally speaking, it just traveled from one building to another because they had interconnecting floor joists, ceiling joists, roof joists. Everything was interconnecting. They built some very sturdy buildings years and years ago, but they didn't think about fire separations. So when we had a fire in a building on Market Street, generally speaking, it may have went in two different directions also. But anyway, these are hanging on several buildings still yet here in Portsmouth, Ohio. It's heavy. And I would imagine that's a keepsake for me anyway.
Definitely. And I didn't know you're in the fire department. We'll hold on to that. I'll come back to that. I have questions about that for you.
All right.
All right. And I know you mentioned just a second ago that you were in the Navy.
Yes.
And do you remember what year did you enter that?
Pardon me?
What year did you go to the Navy?
1953, when I graduated from Portsmouth High School.
Okay, great. And why did you choose the Navy?
Well, I had a part-time job at Bickus Machine Shop over on 11th Street when I was in high school. I got out of school at 12 o'clock to go to work at Bickus Machine Shop as a senior, and I was out in the yard working on some projects in these welding machines, and three of my classmates came by to say hi, and they said something about going down and joining the Navy, and I said, well, I'd like to do that too. And so I went in to see Mr. Bickett, the owner, and I said, Mr. Bickett, I said, I got some buddies out here in the yard, and they want me to join the Navy with them. He said, well, if I were you, I'd go down and join the Navy with them, come back and see me when you get out. And that was no big problem. Mr. Bickett was a nice man, and he always tried to hire 2 or 3 high school seniors or juniors and give them a little part-time work here in Portsmouth. So it's a nice place.
Let's see. And when you were in the Navy, what did you do there? What was your...
Well, the last 2 years in high school, I was in machine shop trades. And I ran drilling machines, drill presses, and lathes and all that. And when I got out of boot camp, the counselor asked me what I wanted to do, just as you did. I said, well, for the last 2 years I've been in a machine shop setting, working and going to school and all that, and I'd like to continue my occupation as a machinist in the Navy. He said, well, that's probably a pretty good idea. You're probably well qualified, but we don't think you're smart enough to be a machinist.
Well, that's nice.
But my grades and scores and all that, so I said, oh, well, then whatever happens, happens. He said, but I got a deal for you. And I said, what's that? He said, we can send you to Aviation Structural Mechanics School. I said, what do they do? He said, oh, they work on airplanes. I said, no. I said, you're telling me that I'm not smart enough to run a drill press, something I've been doing for the last 2 years, but I'm smart enough to work on something I had never seen. I had never seen an airplane to that date in life. And he said, yeah. I said, okay, you're on. And that was the best job. I was an airframes mechanic on reciprocating aircraft for the United States Navy, on board aircraft carrier Intrepid and at various naval air stations and all that. So, good job.
All right.
But I didn't want to go first.
Well, yeah.
So,
let's see. Before you left, you said you went into the Navy in '53. So what was, you grew up in Sauter County, what was, were people's thoughts about right then? Were they encouraging lots of young people to join the military, or was it,
well, when I got out of high school, the Korean War was winding down, but I was still 1A. Everybody had a draft classification. I was classified 1A, and I'm sure had I not went in the Navy, I would have been drafted eventually, because the Korean War was still going on. But like I said, the tail end of it, I think that the people were very patriotic. I don't remember anybody demonstrating against the war. Now, maybe they were somewhere else, but to my knowledge, there was no rumbles going on in the Portsmouth area about not going into the military or what have you. I'm sure most of the men and women, young men and women, wanted to go to college. Some of them couldn't. Some had to work. Some had to go into service. And a lot of my buddies went with me to service. A lot of them remained here and went to work at Williams Shoe Factory, Detroit Steel, out the atomic plant. It was really kicking in at that particular time. So there was a lot of work in Portsmouth, Ohio in the early 50s. This place was really crowded. 60, 70,000 people in our little community right here. They were living, every alley house had an apartment in it. They were living everywhere.
Wow.
And I was off in the Navy, so, you know. But anyway, it was a crowded town at that particular time, and you could get a job. When I was in high school, if a young man or a young woman wanted to get a part-time job, you could get it here in Portsmouth, Ohio. We had 7, 8, 9, 10 theaters that all employed 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 young people as ushers and cashiers and candy machine operators and all that. I worked, before I went to Bickett Machine Shop, I was employed at the Lyric Theater. And when I turned 16, you had to be 16 to get the necessary papers, go to work and all that. Well, they paid me 40 cents an hour at the Lyric Theater, and had a little uniform and all that, and we worked 20 hours a week. Most generally, my hours of work was on Saturday and Sunday, and on a Thursday evening when they had a drawing at that particular time. And I worked there until I got my better job at Bickett Machine Shop. And I was able to get the job at Bickett Machine Shop because of the training that I received at Portsmouth High School in the vocational department, which was that little building that's set to the left of the high school. It's still there, but I don't know what they do in it, you know. But anyways, a person could find a job if they wanted in Portsmouth, Ohio at that particular time. 1957, when I got out of the Navy, things had really quieted down. The atomic plant was slowing down. It had been built. Now they were just into the normal hiring procedure. Detroit Steel, they were on a slowdown. Three of my buddies that went to work there when they got out of high school were now laid off. We were all laid off. I was laid off from the Navy. They was laid off from Detroit Steel. However, I did have an option to go back into the Navy at that particular time, but I chose not to go back on active duty. When I first enlisted in the Navy, it was an 8-year military obligation. And today, it's a 6-year military obligation, meaning that in my case, it was 4 years of active duty and then 4 years of inactive duty. Well, I was still in the reserve program. I thought I got discharged, but I just got separated to the reserve program, which turned out to be a good deal. I didn't particularly like it at the particular time, but it was a good deal. So anyways, things were really tight. I couldn't get a job. I tried different places and said, "Oh, we're laying off right now." And I went up to Ashland Oil in Ashland, Kentucky, and I told them I'd been in the Navy, and he said, "Oh, that's good. We need people for our river boats, you know, going up and down the river." And the guy said, "Well, what'd you do?" I said, "I worked on airplanes." And he said, "Well, we don't need any airplane mechanics here. We need guys that can chip and paint and work on engines and all that." Well, if I'd had another occupation when I was in the Navy, they would have probably hired me. But I can understand why they didn't. I don't know anything about running engines and all that stuff, you know. So, anyways, I eventually become active in the Naval Reserve program. And 1960, 61, something like that. Started attending the reserve meetings over on Charles Street, and at that particular time, there's probably 200, 250 people, Marines and sailors, attending meetings there on Charles Street. It was $1.5 million a year income for the city of Portsmouth, Ohio. There was a lot of people came from far away just to attend reserve meetings here in Portsmouth. And I attended the meetings. I was in the fire department by then, and 1965, I decided I wanted to go back on active duty in the Navy, so I went back on active duty for 2 years. The Vietnam War was going on. They didn't care what you could do or how old you were. This is you're a warm body. Come on in, we need you. Well, I lucked out. I become the recruiter over here at the reserve centers for 2 years. I was 2.5 years. I was a Naval Reserve recruiter, and probably got in 400, 500 people, and of all the people that I enlisted in the Navy, we only had one loss, a boy from Portsmouth, Ohio, and he was up in the North Atlantic, and they were in a storm, and he got washed overboard, and he didn't make it back. And that was a tragic affair for us. It was a sad occasion. It was a sad funeral I have to go to. But anyways, I spent 2.5 years on active duty as a recruiter, and then went back in the fire department, and eventually retired out of the Naval Reserve program in 1986 as a chief petty officer. So that's about basically my military history. Mm-hmm. A lot of little interesting things along the way, of course, you know, here and there and all that. But
well, I noticed that you were talking about you left to go into the Navy the first time, and then you left again in the early 60s when Vietnam was going on. Were the two experiences different? Did you, obviously you were older, but I know I'd asked about the people around you's feelings about you joining the military. Were they different about returning? Did you have any trouble? Because I know that when I've studied in high school, they talked about all the turmoil of the 60s and the upset. And
there was, like I said, you know, here in Portsmouth, there wasn't much contrary going on about Korea. Vietnam, there was a little bit of ruffles here and there, and people raising Cain. And one sailor that I re-enlisted in the Navy, he was a boatswain mate, and he had been to Vietnam, and he came back, and he, like I, still had some time to do in the reserve program, so I talked him into affiliating with the reserve program, attending the meetings, hoping eventually to send him back on active duty, which that's what our job was to do, get him circulated back in. So he and I were out on liberty, is what they called it in the Navy, but we were out at a restaurant here in Portsmouth one Monday evening, and 4 older people, my age, maybe a little bit older, maybe a little bit younger, I don't know, kind of started running their mouth and raising Cain about the military and not liking us as sailors and all kind of little derogatory remarks about the military. Well, Wesley, my buddy, he excused himself for a moment, and he said, "I got to go to the car." Well, I said, "Wesley, don't leave me yet." You know, I said, "You know, things aren't too cozy right now," and all that. So he came back, and of course we had our pea coats on, and there's a very large sleeve in it. We were sitting there, and these 4 guys sitting right behind us kept getting louder and louder and louder, and Wesley reached up in his coat sleeve, pulled out a .45, and he turned around, he laid on this guy's forehead. And I said, Wesley, don't do that. I said, we can't do that. And he said, you know, to that guy, he said, I've killed a lot of people in the last couple of years, but you'll be the first one ever killed in Portsmouth, Ohio. And he scared the daylights out of me. I don't know how bad he scared them particular people, but it wasn't within maybe 2 or 3 seconds, those 4 gentlemen were out the door and gone. I was sitting there, whew, boy, thanks Wes for not killing him. You are me, but
Right.
there was some animosity and there was some things, little bits and pieces here in Portsmouth, Ohio. Not like San Francisco and San Diego and Norfolk and places where the returning servicemen were coming in and people were throwing rotten eggs at them and doing whatever in the world they could do. It was a terrible situation during and after Vietnam. And you remember the Kent incident, University of Kent. Well, as a member of the fire department, I had occasion to be up there and after the incident where the students got shot. But the aftermath was still terrible. They still didn't like the military up there. I don't think they liked anybody up there that stood for or was with the establishment. I think there was just an anti-establishment situation everywhere, for the lack of a better term. But I didn't like being in Kent State, but we were there, and we learned there how to prepare ourselves here in Portsmouth if something similar would occur. And that's what we were doing in Kent State, myself and some other people from the fire department. It was just an observation or learning situation. So it was all over. Yeah. Yes.
Well, since, could you tell me a little bit about your time in the fire department? When did you start working with them, and did you work with the one in town?
In Portsmouth, Ohio, yes. Went in civil service examination. When I got out of the Navy in like 757, well, they gave the civil service examination in February of 1958. I'm sorry, March of 1958. Well, on a civil service examination, they establish a list that's good for 2 years, and any hiring that the public employees, city, the whatever, fire department, police department, city employees, that list is good for 2 years, and they hire people off the list. Well, my dad, he had been in the fire department most of his life, and I, as a kid, grew up in the fire department, and consequently, I knew the fire chief and all the people that were in a position to do the hiring and all that. Well, on the civil service examination, I come out 13th. So it was not too bad. There was about 195 people took the test, so there was about 14 of us that passed it. So that's not too bad. I was right up near the end. I didn't think I'd ever get a job because, like I said, the process they have to go through, and when a person retired, they would certify 3 people to come in for an interview. Well, they would, most generally speaking, hire the first person, and then the second person, the third person. Well, like I said, I took the test in March of 1958. I got hired in February of 1960, so it was due to expire within 1 month. And when I was called in for my interview, the chief, he said, Jim, I mean, he knew me since I was a little kid. He said, we've got a procedure that we hire the next highest guy on the list, and you're third out right now. He said, we're going to hire this person, and then we'll call you again, and hire this other person. Well, finally, I come down from 13th, I was number 1, finally, almost 2 years later. So I got hired and worked here in Portsmouth and stayed there for 25 years, and ended up retiring as the fire chief. And I went to work for the Ohio Fire Marshal in Columbus, and we worked throughout the state of Ohio, and in Dayton, Columbus, Marietta, Portsmouth, you name it. My normal assignments were Gallia County, Lawrence County, Soda County, and Adams County. That's where I would normally work, but every now and then we'd have to go to the bigger cities and help them out. One Christmas Eve, I was in Columbus, Ohio, going through the Hyatt Regency. And I said, what are we doing up here on Christmas Eve? The building superintendent said, that's what I'm trying to figure out. He said, I got more important things to do to get ready for Christmas than to run around with you guys. Well, me and another fellow had to go up and check something out, and we were in the Hyatt Regency on Christmas Eve, and I said, I'll never do that again. Well, I would have had they sent me, you know what I mean? But it was a lot of different things than what we did in the fire department. Called upon to do a lot of things and travel here and there and all. It was exciting, and I enjoyed the job. I finally retired in 2006.
Huh. Let's see. What was your most memorable or most unusual experience with the fire department? I know it's a tough one. I threw it right at you.
How about all of it?
Yeah.
Because it was certainly a good job, and it was a long job, and probably the biggest situation, my very first situation, I was in the fire department maybe 2 weeks, and we had a cabinet factory down on Market or 2nd Street that burned, and the fire was right back in the middle of the building where the paint locker was at, where it originated. So I'm brand new, and Orville Greenwood, the guy that's with me that's hanging on the back of the fire truck, he's brand new. So we got down there, and then we started pulling our fire hose off as we'd been instructed to do, and we were standing there squirting water on the fire because it already came through the roof. And John Rudity, who's our assistant chief, he said, come on boys, he said, the fire's not out here, the fire's in there. So there we are right in the middle of that building, burning and everything falling. But John Rudity, the assistant chief, was right there with us. That was my first experience. And we did, as all the time, go into the fire. We did not wait till the fire come to us, except in one situation, and it was called the Carolina Lumber Company fire. And at 1:15 in the morning, one of our firefighters looked out the back window of Guy Street Station. He saw a little flame, and 15 minutes later, the whole thing was on fire. Once it got into the sawdust and the flammables, the liquids, and everything else that would be common to a sawmill, it was just all over. And it went from Lincoln Street right on down to Austin Street, the whole area. And one of the things that we were criticized for is we didn't have any water, which we didn't. There were some fire hydrants right in that area, but they were what we referred to as a dead-end fire hydrant that they had run out of water, for the lack of a better sense. Normally, in our city, we have all our fire hydrants and fire mains are looped in. You got a supply coming into this direction, you got a supply coming in this direction, so if something happens here, you still got a supply coming from this direction. Well, the fire hydrants over on 10th Street, where Carolina Lumber Company is at, were dead-end hydrants. They had no additional supply, and several of the videos and several of the photos that were taken, which I have one home, Ed Brown, who's a captain, shows him there with a fire hose, and he's hooked into a hydrant right in front of the Carolina Lumber Company, and the water's going about 10 feet out. And as there was just no water there, our pumpers was running all over the place trying to find a fire hydrant that had some water in it. It was a bad situation for us. It was a bad situation for our community. We lost a very good lumber mill, and in all probability, even with a good adequate water supply, we couldn't have saved it. It was an act of arson at that same particular time, or within close proximity of each other. Carolina Lumber Company in Portsmouth, Ohio burned. Carolina Lumber Company in Iceland, Kentucky burned. Carolina Lumber Company in Huntington, West Virginia burned. And we feel it was a result of a disgruntled nephew, which we were able to come up with some stuff on that and everything. But probably the most exciting time was trying to put out the fire at the Carolina Lumber Company. It went on for days, you know what I mean? So I had a lot of other memorable times. The camaraderie in the fire department was great. You know, you're eating with someone, you're living with someone, really, with that particular individual more than your wife or your children, because you're there for that 24-hour time period, and if you go home and something happens, they call you up, you're back out with him or her another 8, 10, 12 hours. So most of the time we spent with our co-workers, and we got to know each other quite well. As I kind of mentioned a while ago, we knew their wives, we knew their children, we knew where they lived, we knew what they could do and what they couldn't do. We knew almost everything that someone could know about another person. We eventually learned it over there drinking a cup of coffee or doing something, playing pinochle, euchre, got past time of day.
Well, I know that you've probably seen a lot of changes about Portsmouth and really the entire county. What do you think has been the most significant change that you've
in our
seen?
Community?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, of course, that Shawnee State and its growth certainly this might be the salvation for our community. I attended Floodwall Tech. You know what Floodwall Tech was, don't you? Ohio University Portsmouth branch. Well, and eventually graduated from there on a GI Bill, and it started over, of course, Portsmouth High School, and eventually got Massey Hall down on 2nd Street. And while I was attending classes, they had a meeting down there, brought everybody into the existing auditorium. Oakley Collins, a senator from up Gallia, Lawrence County, Vern Rife, House of Representatives from here in Portsmouth, and Governor Jim Rhodes were all on the stage at Massey Hall, and the governor's in the middle, and here's Vern Rife, and here's Oakley Collins, and they're talking about building a college in Portsmouth, Ohio, and building one, improving on one in Ironton, and improving on one at Rio Grande, which is Rio Grande University. Well, these gentlemen were hugging on each other and the best of friends, a Democrat and a Republican, or whatever they may have been, but they said, we will build a college or a university in Portsmouth, Ohio, and there it is. The only thing that, you know, when they tear down a house where somebody lives, or they tear down a business where somebody works, you're losing money off the tax duplicate. And just like the expansion of Portsmouth High School, look at all the tax-paying properties that were tore down. Same thing with Shawnee State. We need Shawnee State. We needed our high school, but it will eventually start costing us in our tax duplicate, as our property tax has to pick up somewhere to pick up the difference. But the biggest asset we have, I think, is Shawnee State University. Now, I'm glad it's here. And we certainly get a lot of notoriety with their sports programs. They've been everywhere. They talk about Portsmouth, Ohio. So we get a lot of notoriety from it and all that. It's great.
Is there anything else that you just really want to tell us about? And we'd love to hear it.
I don't know, I'd probably sit here and talk all day long, but I don't want to labor on you, and I know you have to go, but I can recall one thing, and I think we never need to forget, the Second World War. I mean, it was a very tragic event, December 7, 1941, and I was just a young kid, probably 9, 10 years old, what have you. Well, I was at the Lyric Theater on a Friday or Saturday afternoon, what it was, when the war was over in Japan. And on the Esplanade, there was a bunch of billboards there that had our servicemen and women's names on them. And they'd have this big billboard right here and have so-and-so's name listed, so-and-so's name listed. And another section that killed in action, and they would remove the person's name from that particular board there and put it over on another billboard. Well, that was a big gathering place in the city while I was growing up, and people gathered around it all the time. Well, Well, that was right across the street from the Lyric Theater where the billboards were at. Well, when the manager came on the stage and said the Second World War was over, I was watching a movie, Back to Bataan by John Wayne, and they were going in to finish the war. Of course, that was in a movie. He said the shows shut down, said everybody go home. Well, I came outside and I'm, 10 years old, 12 years old, whatever. I'm trying to find a bus to try to get back to Maybert Road on. There was hundreds of people just started gathering and getting around the boards and looking at these names and talking and hugging and kissing and just, oh boy, just having a great time because the war's over, crying because someone did not make it, will not make it back. But the ending of the Second World War was something else. Our guys, our men that came home in the service were wild. Of course, they'd been killing people for 5 years. I mean, fighting, killing, that's all they knew. And they came home very disturbed individuals. I had a particular uncle who was a gentleman, one of the nicest people ever met. He was a total mess when he came home from the Second World War. And we were, my mom and dad and everybody were having a little welcome home dinner for him up at our house on Maybert Road, and grandma, aunts, uncles, everybody was there, and this guy and that guy, and I took a paper bag, and you've blown up a paper bag and popped it before, I'm sure, as most kids have, so I was having a good time and everything. I blew this paper bag up, popped it. My uncle jumped straight up there, and the next thing I knew, he was hiding behind the couch. He was just shell-shocked. But when he heard that loud noise, I guess it kind of hit him for a little bit. And he was messed up for a long, long time, as were a lot of our men and women then and now, from over in the Middle East and all that. So we can't forget that. And the Middle East, we're going to get out of there. I don't know what we're doing there to start with. But I'm not out campaigning against it. I'm not out burning the flag. I'm not out burning my draft card. I'm not out doing this anti-government stuff. I'm in full support of our men and women that are in harm's way.
Do either of you guys have any other questions you want to ask him?
I'd like to ask about that Carolina lumber. What year was that? Do you
Carolina lumber
fire? Yeah, when was that?
Would that have been about 1972?
1972.
Something like that.
Okay.
I should know. 72, 73, something like that.
Okay.
That was a nice little event. Jim Elliott, do you know Jim Elliott?
No.
He just retired out of the fire department. Well, in our old fire station up at Guy Street, the old one, had a big double door in the back. That's where they brought the hay in for the horses. So that just had this hay loft, but since then it had been turned into kind of a utility room or what have you. And Jim Elliott was standing in the back window looking north towards the Carolina Lumber Company at 1 o'clock in the morning, 1:15 in the morning, and he said there was no sign of a problem over there at all. And 1:15, the alarm came in, and they were out of the way, a block away going to the fire. Ralph Bustler, who was lieutenant, he got off the pumper and had these 3 or 4 young people with him, and he said, "Boys," he said, "you know that fire service training manual you've been reading and studying and all that, memorizing?" He said, "Well, don't pay any attention to it tonight because it's not going to work with this lumber company fire here." And then they went to work, and 2 days later they come off of it. Basically it was a long time period. And the biggest problem, it being a lumber mill, a high hazard, of course, and then not having any water to kind of slow it down a little bit. A lot of the houses on across the railroad track on 10th Street got scorched and burned, but we were able to cool them down. A lot of the buildings that was the rear on 11th Street, we were able to cool them down to keep them from burning, but some of them the paint did blister on a few of them. And that was, I think, 1972, along that time.